Hi, my name is Heather Jeans, and I'm here with the Samuel Proctor Oral History Program with UF with Alyssa Small as well. We're here to interview Chuck Meide. May you go ahead and spell your name for us?
Chuckmeide.
All right, thank you so much. And it is June 3rd, 2022, and we are in St. Augustine, going to be talking to you about some of your previous experiences. You know, LAMP, you're the lighthouse director for LAMP, and also with Fort Mose as well. But first, do you consent to being videotaped and having this published online?
I do, yes.
All right, perfect. So, where were you born and when?
I was born in Jacksonville, Florida, in March of 1971, and I grew up in Atlantic Beach, Florida, so one of the beaches towns.
What are some of your earliest memories of Florida or even St. Augustine?
Sorry, that's a little loud. Earliest memories of Florida and St. Augustine? Well, all of my early memories are of Florida because that's where I grew up. I remember, I always loved St. Augustine when I was a kid. So I remember being brought by my parents to St. Augustine and walking around St. George Street and going to the fort, especially. I loved the Castillo de San Marcos. I remember when I was a little boy, my dad telling me that there could have been Spanish conquistadors walking through our backyard, and he was talking about the Spanish under Menendez and the French under Ribault, which was a story that played out dramatically in St. Augustine in 1565. So I had those stories from more or less as early as I can remember. So I always had an appreciation for St. Augustine and its history. And I remember even as a little kid, people would ask me, where do you want to live when you grow up? And I'd say, St. Augustine, and here I am. So.
Because of all of the stories and...
Probably, I loved, growing up, I loved the water, the ocean, being in the water, and I loved history. And so this certainly, my career now is a combination of those two things. And I had a particular, interest and really loved St. Augustine. So.
Made you want to come back?
Yeah, well, and then when I got into archaeology, made me want to think about doing archaeology in St. Augustine. So I was learning archaeology and then shipwreck archaeology, underwater archaeology in Tallahassee and a lot of different places in the Gulf of Mexico, say, and other places, and down in the Keys. But I always had St. Augustine in the back of my mind as a place that would be really a very interesting place to do maritime archaeology. So interestingly enough, it worked out that way. So.
And then going off of that, so for your school career, going into maritime archaeology, what were you specifically studying? Was there a focus?
Well, so I was at Florida State University in the Department of Anthropology. That's a traditional anthropology department in the old Boasian method. And so basically it's a four-field anthropological approach. So I had a kind of a classic background training in cultural anthropology, archaeology, physical anthropology, and linguistics. And but of course they had underwater archaeology, and I remember in high school I saw that in the the list of classes that were available, and I used to want to be a writer, and then I was always, I came from an FSU family, so I was excited that I could go to school at Florida State. And I liked the idea of being an anthropology major. I was, the idea of studying human culture was very interesting, and the idea of doing archaeology was. And then I saw they had underwater archaeology classes, and I thought, well, that's pretty interesting. So that probably sealed the deal for me that I wanted to be an anthropology major. And I kind of went back and forth some. I think I was an anthropology major, and I switched to an English major, and then I switched to a double major because I enjoy writing, which is an important part of being an archaeologist, of course, and being a communicator. But I can certainly remember my first anthropology class, Introduction to Cultural Anthropology, and I was pretty much hooked from that day forward. Mojo, hush. And it just was really appealing. The idea that there was so much variation in human cultures, and none were superior to others. But you could really learn a lot about human beings and societies and cultures, and so that got me started. And then I took a field school in terrestrial archaeology, which I was excited about that, I guess. And that was after I had an intro to archaeology class, which I really enjoyed. And I actually remember in that class learning about St. Augustine and Kathy Deegan's work in St. Augustine. And particularly, I remember kind of the race-based hierarchy in Spanish society at St. Augustine, and the different names that were used for different kind of classes of people, and how Kathy Deegan had done archaeology in particular households and was able to use archaeology to look at things like race and status and gender and ethnicity. And so that was really appealing to me, especially since it was in my backyard, St. Augustine. And so you had to ask the teacher of the class, who was Rochelle Marinan. So she had been a fellow student with Kathy Deegan. And you had to ask permission to take the field school. So I was a little nervous because she could be a pretty imposing figure. But she allowed me in the field school, and I was doing archaeology on a Spanish, late 17th, early 18th century Spanish mission site. So that was really interesting. And that same semester, I was in my first underwater archaeology class, and kind of an introduction to underwater archaeology. So a classroom class, not out in the field or diving or anything. And I aced that class. I didn't quite have the grade I would have hoped for in the field school, but I did great in the underwater archaeology class, and I was really excited. And that's the same semester that I learned to dive. So that was in spring semester of 1991. And so I became a diver and became an archaeologist at the same time. And I do remember Dr. Marinan, one time we were sitting around eating lunch or something on the site, and she said something like, "Oh, well, one day, you might be Dr. Meide with students of your own." I'm like, "Oh, that could be an interesting career path." So I suppose I was thinking about archaeology as a career from that very first field school. And then the following semester, let's see, it would have, maybe it was fall of 91, and then it was spring of 92, is when, anyway, it was spring of 92 when I had my first underwater archaeology field class. So we had a class called Techniques of Underwater Site Research, and we had a class called Applications of Diving to Science. And the techniques class was sponsored by the Anthropology department, A&T 4131, and the applications of diving to research that's what it was, diving to research rather than science. That was sponsored by the biology department, but they were very multidisciplinary classes. So we had students from biology and anthropology and oceanography and geology, and so it was a very broad focus. But there was a lot of underwater archaeology because it was sponsored by the Anthro department. That was probably the primary focus of that first class. And that's where I learned to do research projects. That's where I learned that you can have the best laid plans in an underwater context, and you can accomplish nothing despite having really prepared to get something done. It's not always easy to do archaeology underwater.
So how did you first get involved with the Fort Mose project?
Well, so Fort Mose, I've known about Fort Mose. I don't know when I first, I can't remember. I was trying to think the other day when I first learned about Fort Mose, because a lot of people have never heard of Fort Mose. It's a very underappreciated archaeological site and an underappreciated history, and just, largely unknown outside of St. Augustine. But I can't remember. I mean, I was pretty young. I think I've known about Fort Mose for a long time. So I remember when I was at FSU in graduate school, I remember going through my old professor, my mentor, George Fisher, was the guy who founded underwater archaeology for the National Park Service. And so he was retired from the Park Service, and he taught for 30 years. He taught at FSU. And so I remember going through old papers of his, and one of them was a proposal. I think it was probably for George's class, but it was a proposal for a joint terrestrial and underwater survey to locate Fort Mose. And that was, gosh, I can't remember the guy's name now who wrote it, but I thought that was really interesting. And that's back, and he was a student of Deegan's, of Kathy Deegan's, who used to be at FSU. So this was back, Larry Kruger was the guy's name, maybe 76, maybe, something like that. So before Fort Mose had been found, there had been ideas from the very start to do underwater archaeology in tandem with terrestrial archaeology to find and first understand the site of Fort Mose. So I knew, I photocopied that paper, and I had a copy of that paper for years and years, and the original, I think, has been lost now. So if I hadn't photocopied that, there might not be another copy anywhere. And certainly our colleagues, Lori and Liz, had never seen that paper before. So that was something I added to their literature database that they've compiled. So when I came to St. Augustine, I cited that paper in some of our first research designs when we were doing the First Coast Maritime Archaeology Project, which was a grant we got that funded us to do a very broad-scoped, regional-based archaeology program, maritime archaeology program. And one of the things we did do in, I think it was 2009, either 2008 or 2009, we did a side scan sonar survey of Robinson Creek. So the same creek that we now traverse every day to get to the site. So that was probably officially, and because old Larry Kruger's Larry's project never got off the ground. It doesn't seem, as far as I know. There was no, it was a proposal he had written, and I don't have any evidence that they ever did any kind of underwater search looking for it. And then we all know, like, some of the early work with Fairbanks and Deegan and all of that stuff. But so we did an acoustic survey of the creek, sonar survey, and then we didn't do very much at Fort Mose for a long time. That was always in the back of my mind. And then Dr. Lori Lee got hired by Flagler, and I was really excited. Actually, I had a friend who had applied for that job, and so I was excited for my friend because I thought she had a decent shot of getting it. And I remember she told me, well, I would love to get this job, but man, one of my best friends from Syracuse is applying. Her name's Lori Lee. So if she got this job, I wouldn't be disappointed because she'd be really great in this. And so that was kind of my introduction to Lori. And upon meeting her and seeing how captivated and how loyal her students were to her, I just got more and more respect for her as an archaeologist and as a teacher. And then I found out that she was involved in starting up excavations at Fort Mose again. And it's almost like a no-brainer. Like, I wonder, like, well, why weren't we doing this 10 or 20 years ago? Because a really long time had gone by. I mean, it may be that once Kathy Deegan, who is respected and loved by everybody, but once Kathy Deegan has worked that site, it's almost sacred ground, even more than it already is sacred ground. I think for many of us, that's part of, Fort Mose is just, it's an honor to work at Fort Mose, I believe, because of what the site is, what it represents, the people who live there and the struggle they had to make for themselves, and the triumphs that they had just to be able to live at Fort Mose. But then as an archaeologist, the fact that Kathy Deegan did the superlative work at Fort Mose, and demonstrated that indeed it was Fort Mose, and Jane Landers, both very respected. Maybe no one wanted to touch it for a while, but in retrospect, it's about time that we get back there, or somebody gets back there, because the site's under threat. Kathy has pointed out how much the coastline has eroded since she was there. So in her living memory, it's a visible, recognizable difference in the landscape. And so, 20 years goes by like that. Another 20 years, we're going to be going back, looking at it, and it'll be a lot different than it looks now. So now's the time. And the idea of looking underwater, more of the site is going to be underwater in 20 years, in 30 years. And at some point, maybe all of the site's going to be underwater. So there's no time like the present to get out in the water and excavate and see what you can recover, see what you can recognize in what is probably redeposited material. That's one of our basic questions. Can we kind of salvage things that may have been in a different context that are, have now eroded into the creek bed? And we are finding artifacts, so that's pretty interesting, but we're right at the beginning. We have a grant right now that is paying for the work that we are doing at Mose. That grant is called, we call it Hermidams, which is, let's see if I can, there's a lot of letters in that acronym. It's Hurricane Irma Damage Assessment and Mitigation Strategy. And so we have proposed that we would look at 10 different archaeological sites that in theory could have been impacted by Hurricane Irma in particular. So this money was set aside for the National Park Service to fund grants to look at hurricane impact, in particular Hurricane Irma. Now I think it's hard, if the grant money doesn't show up until years after Hurricane Irma, and then there's a COVID pandemic that prevents you from getting out in the field even longer, it can be hard to tell any particular impact is related to Irma or not, but it is an opportunity to look at the impact of increased storm activity on sites like this. And we picked 10 maritime sites. I certainly consider Fort Mose a maritime site. It's surrounded by water. Part of the archaeological site is in the water, and the people who live there were a maritime community. They used boats every day. They ate oysters. They fished. They used nets. Their fort was open to the waterfront, so they had a working waterfront that was right adjacent to their living residences and their military defense structure. So, you know, that's of great interest to me. But so our grant that's funding us now is focused not just on Mose, but other sites as well. So this is the amount. We came out last summer as well. So I guess Lori with Dr. Davidson had begun, their first field season was in 2019. That's the first time in a really long time, since the 80s, I believe, that anyone had done anything at Fort Mose other than our little sonar survey. But, and we did assist some with the 2019 research. So Lori asked if we could help get some of the heavier equipment. At that point in time, they were walking through the wetlands to get to the site. And so I think the Indy, who almost never fails, but the Indy had engine problems. So we had the Indy at the dock and we were unable to use her. But Lori was able to convince one of the deans to provide some money to rent a pontoon boat. And so then we captained the pontoon boat and got a lot of equipment out to the site. And then at the end of the field school, end of their season, Indy was back in good shape, and we shuttled all that gear out for them. So we helped from the very first season, and that's when I met Liz Ibarola, and she's fantastic. And I had met Davidson before. I'd seen him lecture about his work at Bulow Plantation. I was familiar with his work at Kingsley Plantation, and I had I talked with him, I think, after I saw him speak, and then I maybe saw him at a few conferences or things like that. And of course now we're old buddies. But so then 2020 field season got canceled. 2021, we had our Hermidams grant, and this was really the first major field work, the first major project that we did after having kind of shut down field work because of COVID. So we did not have our permits yet to do our underwater archaeology, and that took a really long time. We made the decision we had been planning on getting to Fort Mose, but later in the year. And when we had written that grant, we had talked with Lori, and she was very supportive of the idea of collaborating. And so we knew we wanted to get out to Mose. We didn't think, we didn't have time to get our research design finished and our permits in time to be there during the 2021 field school that was jointly sponsored by UF and Flagler. But they didn't have any other choice. The field school would have been canceled because they didn't, they had been told at the very last minute they were no longer allowed to walk through the marsh. And so they couldn't get out there. And so we talked to our boss and said, look, we have an opportunity to save this field school. It's a really important site. We can do terrestrial archaeology under their permit, and that will fall under the purview of our grant. So it made sense for us to do it, even if it meant putting off doing underwater work for a little bit. And so I called Davidson. I called Davidson up because we had some problems with insurance, and we had our administrators wanted to make sure that there was insurance, that there would be liability. And, it's always an issue when you're doing field work or when you're taking people out on boats. And they had thought it was a dead end, and Davidson was writing an email to his grad students saying, to the two teaching assistants saying, look, I'm sorry, we're not going to be able to pay you because the field school is going to be canceled. When I called him and he picked up the phone, and I said, look, I've just cleared it with my boss. We are able to provide you boat transportation every day for your field school. And he was pretty happy. He was pretty grateful. So he didn't have to send that email. And so instead, we did the first, not the first digging there since 2019. So the first excavation since the pandemic. Those were the heyday, the halcyon days of, oh, well, everyone's vaccinated now, so no one will get sick. And then we had a few quarantines happen during field school. So we learned the hard way in July of 21 that you still had to be really careful when you were out there, and that could, the pandemic could impact your field work. But LAMP, we had our own unit, so we had a nice amphibious unit, one that started in a terrestrial context but was right on the slope, and that's Unit 11. 11A and B are kind of the two 1x1s that make up this 2x1. And so we got a number of levels excavated in that unit, and we've restarted that this year and are continuing that. And so we, as you guys know, it's interesting doing underwater archaeology at Fort Mose. It's very tidally based. Sometimes the tide is too low to be able to do underwater archaeology, so we've been kind of leapfrogging from one unit to another depending on the tide. And that tide window can change pretty drastically. So this was a good week for us, whereas the week before was a pretty lousy week for us. Because every day the tide's an hour later. But if you have a low tide in the middle of the day, 3 hours before that low and 3 hours after, it's going to be pretty low. So that could be almost the entire workday. So it's an interesting way to do archaeology, but that's how maritime archaeology is. It's always overcoming challenges and making things work that seem unworkable. So,
are there benefits in preservation in maritime archaeology versus terrestrial archaeology?
Well, yeah, that's a canned question. That's an easy one. Certainly, you have potential for phenomenal organic preservation in a marine context, in a submerged context, that you just wouldn't have on dry land. Unless you are like in ancient Egypt kind of archaeology. So if you're in a desert, you have an extremely arid landscape, you can have things that are really well preserved. And the exact opposite is a completely submerged, wet all the time context, and you can have things really well preserved. But normally if you have rain and then it dries out and rain and it dries out, that's not good for basketry or leather or things like that, wood artifacts. So we have potential. It would not. One of the things we are hoping to find are the palm logs that I think would have been used to construct Fort Mose with. I just would have to think that there would have been some kind of base structure and then maybe earthenwork on top of that. But those palm logs certainly would survive in a marine context. And we know that because we have sections of some of the other defensive lines, like the Kubo line or these other lines of palm logs that were used to defend St. Augustine. So same time period, roughly, as Fort Mose. And the city archaeologist has, former city archaeologist has brought up a preserved palm log. And actually brought it to us because we're the underwater experts. So we have, I think we still have it in wet storage. So that's the kind of thing we could find, an actual part of Fort Mose. And that is the purpose of our trench that's made up of units 17 and 19 that are adjacent to each other. In addition to you could find anything. And again, this is an interesting site because where we're digging right now used to be terrestrial. It used to be within the fort, or else on the margin, the interface between the inside and outside of the fort. We're trying to locate that wall, like I said. So I don't know. It's hard to know. It depends on how long it took for that dry land to become inundated, how much erosion happened. There's all kinds of variables that we are just beginning to get our heads wrapped around. We've seen some changes. Liz was surprised yesterday to find a little copper artifact And she was, she exclaimed like, well, but it's, it looks like copper though. It's, it's not, it's still copper colored. And we're like, oh yeah, that's not too surprising. So you can sometimes get, green or black copper underwater, but sometimes it's nice and shiny and it looks just like copper, brand new. And so that fitting, we are not quite sure what it is, and we don't know a date, and it may not date to the 18th century, but it certainly could. It doesn't look all that different than the kinds of artifacts we brought up from the storm wreck, which went down in 1782. So yeah, things are preserved differently underwater than they are on land, and so that's why this holistic approach of looking everywhere in both contexts is really interesting for a site this important.
And then, knowing the importance of this site, what are your hopes for the future of this site and the history of St. Augustine?
Well, that's a good question. I've got high hopes and high expectations for Fort Mose. I think that there's a number of things that are kind of coming together at the same time. So one of those things is our renewal, our resurgence of archaeological investigations at Mose. We have gone back where Kathy Deegan has tread before, and with her blessing, of course, and we are doing archaeology, and we are training the next generation of archaeologists at this first-class site. And so we are reminding other archaeologists out there that this site exists and why it's so important. We will be, making a name for Fort Mose again. So the archaeological community is going to be aware of what we are doing, because we've already had a session at the Society for Historical Archaeology conference. Lori is working on a collaboration with DAX, the digital archive of slavery, to include Fort Mose artifacts in their database system. So Fort Mose is being integrated to the wider world of archaeology. At the same time, Fort Mose is about to hit center stage in the public eye. Fort Mose, the earliest struggles to bring Fort Mose to the public, to make this important site appreciated by the public, resulted in community movement and community support to turn the site into a state park. Then the visitor center opened up at the state park, and there's a great little museum there. The reenactors are great. So there's already a lot going on at Fort Mose, but the one thing that's not going on there is a fort. So people expect to see a fort, they don't see a fort. That's probably the number one question they get at the state park: where's the fort? Well, they are currently raising funds to build a replica of the 1738 fort. And I just think that's going to just be a game changer. That's going to change everything. It will, all of a sudden, it's going to be on the map. It'll be a major destination for heritage tourism, and we're a mecca for heritage tourism at St. Augustine. That's why I have my job. That's why you can have an underwater archaeology research program, which is a pretty expensive kind of archaeology, but we are fueled by tourism dollars, and people come to St. Augustine because it's beautiful and has wonderful beaches, but they come because of the history and because of the heritage, we're a unique mix of, just like our site, a unique mix of natural beauty and historic significance. And so when right now the archaeology is really hitting its stride, and this fort's going to happen. We have the current terrestrial research is funded by a National Park Service grant, a battlefield preservation and planning grant. We are hoping to have 2 more years of funding through a grant we have just applied for, a state historic preservation grant. And I think it's a pretty strong proposal. So hopefully we will be able to secure funding and work for 2 more years. And probably before the end of those 2 years, they will, I don't know their time schedule, but I bet they will have already broken ground on a replica of the early fort, Fort Mose I, the 1738 fort. And so that's pretty exciting. So the future of Fort Mose is pretty bright, I think. It is really one of the most underappreciated stories that we have in our history, I think. Most Americans don't know that the Underground Railroad used to run to the south. That's the opposite of people's expectations. But it did. And there was freedom here for these people who otherwise would have had very little hope. And it's a wonderful, triumphant, inspiring, compelling story. And it is going to be told by the work that we do. It's going to be told by the reenactors at Fort Mose and the local community that is proud of that heritage. And it's going to be told by this new fort that's going to speak to millions of visitors. So I can't wait to see how successful the new replica fort is, and it couldn't be happening at a better time as far as we're concerned. So a lot of things are coming together.
Well, thank you so much for this interview, for joining us. Are there any last things you would like to say to include in this interview?
No, I'm pretty happy. It was a lot of fun spending time with both of you, and Fort Mose is, I'm a shipwreck guy at heart, but Fort Mose is a really special kind of site. So I feel really privileged to be. To me, this is a historic project. Again, people have been talking about doing underwater archaeology at Fort Mose since the 70s, and now we're doing it. And so we were privileged to excavate the first underwater unit at Fort Mose and to find artifacts, prehistoric material and historic material, much of which appears to date to the right time period for our fort. So it's pretty exciting. I'm happy to be here and happy to help with your oral history project.
Thank you. And if we have any follow-up questions, are you willing to join us again?
Anytime.
All right. Thank you so much.
Sure thing.